was a tipping point at which wealth became a complete abstract, a threshold of sorts that indicated that the world's reserve currency no longer held any value to most, including and especially Americans. Before the collapse occurred, there were signs that the US dollar had reached the end of its usefulness. As with all currencies of reserve throughout history, once those who controlled the dollar had exceeded the limitations of which people were willing to give that currency the benefit of the doubt, the decline was slow then sudden. Just imagine if you had one item of anything on planet Earth. Let's call it a widget. So you have this one item, one widget, and everybody wants that widget. The fact that you had the only widget in existence would mean that the supply was ultimately as low as it could get, while the demand, if everybody wanted one on Earth, was as high as it could get. What this would mean for you as the seller is that you had a commodity that was near priceless. So imagine that this widget is then duplicated. That widget would therefore be worth half of what it was worth prior to its duplication. Now double that number so that there are 4 widgets. If all other aspects of the widget market remain the same, each widget is now worth 1/4 of its original value. Then take that widget and multiply it times 1,000. Now it is worth 1/1000th of its original value. And though it has diminished, people can still place a value on that widget. It is now, as I said, worth 1/1000th of its original value. Now multiply that times 100, which would mean you now have 100,000 widgets, and the value of that widget drops substantially lower. Multiply that by 10, and now you have 1,000,000 widgets sitting in your warehouse. If you then multiply that by 1,000, you get to 1 billion widgets. Though 1 billion may seem like a lot, it is still a number well within most people's grasp. Most people can visualize 1 billion, but we are getting further and further away from their ability to do so. Now let's take that 1 billion and multiply it by another 1,000, and we are left with 1 trillion widgets. Now we are getting into the realm of the abstract for most people, because it requires that we consider it takes 1,000 million to equal 1 billion, and in turn it would take 1,000 billion to equal 1 trillion. And that 1 trillion was the debt the United States incurred every 100 days in the year 2025. Breaking this number down further indicates that $10 billion of debt is added to the United States balance every single day. If we look back a few or more decades, we find that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s of the 20th century, $1 million was considered enough wealth upon which one could live for a lifetime. By the time the new century hit, however, that same million barely became enough to survive a couple years to a couple decades at most. With inflation, the lack of interest being paid by banks, and the desperation of people seeking a means to survive, that $1 million ironically became a bigger target as it became worth less day by day. The masses had lost touch with how much money the ultra-rich were making in the year 2025 as opposed to what they were making only decades prior. Something the United States vehemently opposed, as was made apparent during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Russia had valid reasons to go into Ukraine, whereas America tried to state that democracy was under threat to America. That and humanitarian reasons were given as justification for America and Europe to enter that proxy war is the height of hypocrisy. And despite their entry into this war, European leaders have allowed their own people to suffer mostly economically due to their participation in this war. And then there is the genocide in Gaza. America has allied itself with Israel, a country that seems intent on attacking all of its neighbors. While at one time Israel looked like they were the victim, it's hard to continue such a ruse when you are blowing up women and children hospitals, all manner of civil infrastructure, and civilians in an effort to root out supposed terrorists hiding underneath the city. It's hard to claim your actions seek to free hostages that are supposedly being held in that city of Gaza when you continuously bomb and blow up everything you can indiscriminately bomb throughout Gaza. It's hard for American and European leaders to claim that they are trying to fight terrorism and to save the only democracy in the Middle East when neither of these objectives seem to be the goal, as peace is ignored time and time again, as ceasefires end before they can actually go into effect. This is apparent because those who in the ceasefire are always from Israel. And when the United States sends Israel $3 or $4 billion every year and increases that number to support yet another proxy war, while a growing number of Americans become homeless, starving, and impoverished every day, It is difficult to claim that American leadership actually cares about Americans. It is difficult to claim that American leaders' actions are justified. It is difficult to even claim that American leaders aren't acting in a treasonous manner. What other conclusion or conclusions could someone who's looking at that war or genocide with a rational mindset come to? For regardless of intention, the end result is that your own citizens starve and die due to exposure and a manufactured scarcity while you send weapons to a foreign country. As the rest of the world turned away from that American empire out of necessity, America continued its decline as its citizens continued to ignore the harm that their leaders were causing, not just to the United States, but to the world in general. By the time most Americans woke up, the damage had been done. The world had moved on. And like all other empires throughout history, the United States had seen to its own demise.